Hola banda, este video va a estar en inglés, porque a diferencia de todos mis otros contenidos, la audiencia destinataria aquí son los gringos en México. Pero puse subtítulos en español para mis seguidores regulares. This video is for all the other Americans living in Mexico, all 1.6 million of us. We've come here for different reasons, but from the digital nomads in La Condesa to the retirees in San Miguel de Allende, we all have one thing in common. The economic conditions in our home country are less favorable to us than the economic conditions in Mexico. You've probably seen the videos recruiting people to come live in Mexico with titles like "Earn dollars and spend in pesos." As members of the Imperial Core, our labor is rewarded at a higher rate than the members of the periphery. Some Americans think that this extra acquisitive power means they have extra rights. This video is to explain why that's not true. I'll start with a little of my own story. I grew up in New York, the Big Apple, baby. But when I became an adult, I realized how hard it was to afford to live there. The lowest rent I ever had was $500, and this was back in 2010. It was for a one-room apartment with no window and a shared bathroom across the hall. This was on 127th Street and Park Avenue, right next to the Metro North Station, which had trains coming in at all hours of the day and night. I had no heat or air conditioning, and every time I tried to cook in my toaster oven, I blew a circuit breaker. There was a local gang in front that sold crack 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, even in the snowstorms. But even that godforsaken hovel wouldn't be available today for less than $2,000. The rental market was always going up, but in the last decade, it's ballooned to something that most working people simply can't afford. And it's not just the case in New York, too. You could say the same about any number of US cities. In my conversations with other foreigners here in Mexico, that increase in prices is a common factor in the decision to move. When I came to Mexico in 2015, I moved to Cuernavaca, where I found a job teaching English. I quickly found an apartment just a block from my job. Now, I was only making 90 pesos an hour, but the rent at this apartment was only 2,200 pesos a month. At the time, the equivalent of about $130. Now, this apartment had multiple windows. It even had a little garden. And best of all, it had a private bathroom. My boss recommended that I get some extra work teaching online. That way I could make dollars. She was doing it, and so were most of my other coworkers. So I found a job making $10 an hour online for giving classes to people in Saudi Arabia. $10 an hour is really not good money in New York, but in Mexico, that goes pretty far. My original plan was just to stay in Mexico for a few months, because I was waiting to hear back from the FDNY Academy. I had done my EMT certification a year before, and so I thought, I'll go to Mexico for a few months, brush up on my Spanish, and when they email me, I'll come back and become an EMT for the Fire Department of New York. But when I got the email confirming my space in the class of 2016, I rejected it. I realized that my life in Mexico as a teacher was far better than trying to make it in New York as a paramedic. In other words, and this is really important, the labor opportunities in my home city and home country did not provide a stable pathway to a better future. I wanted a decent apartment. I wanted to have a long-term relationship, maybe even a marriage, maybe even have some kids, and I didn't see that as possible living in New York. But living here in Mexico, it was. This wasn't the case just a generation ago in the United States. My dad was a union stagehand for 40 years. He managed to provide well for his family with just that job, but at the cost of 60 to 80-hour work weeks, working every weekend, even working Christmas. He also wound up with both of his knees replaced and this mold in his lungs that they say all of the stagehands who work in the ceilings and walls of Broadway theaters get. But hey, at least he has union health insurance. Those few remaining union jobs, like the one he had, are disappearing. Union work and decently paid work in general has been disappearing since the 1980s, when they closed all of the factories in the Midwest and Ronald Reagan fired all of the air traffic controllers. People my age are expected to embrace the gig economy, which is serfdom. You never get a raise, you never get a bonus, you don't get paid days off, you don't get a pension. All of those things that workers in previous generations fought for, those are gone. How are we expected to find a future for ourselves? But as our labor rights and our collective bargaining power have faded away to become a thing of the past, a new, digital frontier has emerged. You can work remotely. You don't need to live in the Imperial Core and pay Imperial Core prices to get an Imperial Core salary. All you need is a computer, the internet, and the right documents. Especially with the increase in work from home opportunities as a result of COVID, more and more Americans are deciding to look exclusively for opportunities where they can work from home and then change where that home is so they can afford to live. As for the retirees, well, they already made their money. But then inflation came and took away the little bit of acquisitive power they thought they would have in their golden years. People who dreamed for decades of buying a little house in the country, get to that point and discover that they don't have enough for a shack. But then they hear about San Miguel de Allende, or Chapala, or Ajijic, or any of another dozen gringo enclaves, and say, ooh, maybe I could get something there. There's realtors who speak English, and they're happy to help them convert their dollars into pesos. So here's what the retirees and the digital nomads just don't seem to understand. That this action, bringing your dollars to Mexico, is not a benevolent one. You are not helping the economy, you are helping yourself. Your own country's economy and markets do not exist to help working or retired people. They exist to exploit those people. So, in seeking refuge from that exploitation, you come to Mexico and decide to start a new life here. Now, back home, what do we call the exploited people who cross our borders looking for better economic opportunities? We certainly don't call them digital nomads or expats or any of the other cringeworthy names that Americans only call themselves. Those people are immigrants, and you and I here in Mexico, we are immigrants. When you go to get your documents, which I hope you will do and not just be illegal here forever, you're not going to go to the Expat Institute. You're going to go to the Instituto Nacional de Migración. It's right there in the name. No matter where you're from in the US, you've met immigrants. You might even be the child of immigrants. My great-grandparents came to the US at the beginning of the 20th century. They were fleeing from the pogroms in Europe and had heard about the streets paved with gold in New York. Of course, the streets at that time didn't have any gold. Lots of horse poop, though. We're familiar with the story of immigration. It's been told in countless movies and books, and it's always an inspiring story about the opportunities in America. Somebody arrives with nothing. They don't even speak the language, but they get a job, and they work hard, and they learn English, and they stop speaking their foreign language, and then their kids are able to get a little slice of that American dream. At least that's how it was supposed to work. But now, in the 21st century, the new wave of immigrants like me aren't dependent on the local job opportunities. We're also not forced to learn the language. In fact, it's quite the opposite because most of our online jobs are conducted entirely in our first language. In my case, I used my first language as a job. Such is the power of English as an imperial language. I think a lot of this attitude that Americans have, that everyone else should speak English, comes from the fact that we're used to being tourists. Now, tourists aren't expected to learn the local language. If you're going to Cancun for a week, why would you bother putting in all of the hours you need to learn Spanish? Everyone at your hotel is going to speak English anyway. We see this back in our home country too. Whichever city you're from, I'm sure you've seen big groups of Chinese tourists who only know hello and thank you. And they stick together so they can speak Chinese with their friends. It's what a lot of Americans do here. That's fine. The problem is, if you're living here, you're no longer a tourist. You're no longer at a hotel on the beach in Cancun with all of those friendly English-speaking employees. No, the people around you have no reason to speak English, and you have no reason to keep trying to speak English to them. Honestly, you couldn't have a better country to be learning a second language in. Mexicans are super patient with people learning Spanish. My first 2 years, I tripped over pronunciations, I said the wrong word, I invented grammatical structures out of thin air, and people listened to me and did their best to understand. Nobody ever screamed at me, go back to your country, or learn to speak well, the way that white Americans do to immigrants back home. Now, people down here understand that it takes time to learn a language, and they respect it. You can show your respect by trying. Even if your pronunciation isn't great, just a modicum of effort will go a long way. But Spanish is just the beginning. As an American in Mexico, there's something even more important you need to learn, and that's the history of US interventions in Mexico. You might have guessed from the name of my YouTube channel, Intervenciones Gringas, but this is what I study. This is what I make content about in Spanish. The history of US empire building in Latin American countries. And they never say, we're invading Panama because we want a canal, or we're invading Honduras because we want the bananas. No, it's always more clever than that. They always use us, the American citizens living in that country. The phrase that they've been repeating since the 1850s is, we must protect the lives and property of American citizens.
General Noriega's reckless threats and attacks upon Americans in Panama created an imminent danger to the 35,000 American citizens in Panama. As president, I have no higher obligation than to safeguard the lives of American citizens.
Something to remember, because maybe you moved in and you told your Mexican neighbor, hey, I'm a US citizen, and he gave you a strange look and you thought, why doesn't he like Americans? Well, historically, Americans moving into your Latin American country has meant that an invasion is coming soon. You should also think about how many Mexicans have family members living and working in the United States, and just how different the immigrant experience is when you go north instead of south. If you're up there without official documents, then you have to keep your head down at all times. You have to speak your first language in hushed tones. You have to watch out for the police so you don't go out at night. Go out to work, come home, and that's it. And your employer? Well, they have to register you with Social Security, but as an illegal immigrant, you're not allowed to claim a refund. So you pay taxes, but get nothing. Now let's think about another group of illegal immigrants. Digital nomads, who come here on a tourist visa and then do profitable activities, which are taxable. Are any of them paying taxes to the Mexican government? Are any of them staying at home at night, not going out, not speaking English because they don't want to be caught and deported? Why is it that when Mexicans come to our country, they have to be on their best behavior at all times? But we think that being in a foreign country is a license to misbehave. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not making this video to say, don't come here or go back where you came from, gringo, because that's simply not going to happen. The material conditions that convince me to stay here are the same conditions that are convincing lots and lots more people to come here. And also, once you get here, life happens. I married a Mexican woman. We got 3 kids together. My future is here. And I'm sure a lot of other Americans feel the same way. What I want to close this video with is just a little bit of advice from me, an immigrant, to you, fellow immigrants, about how to be a better guest in this country. The first step, and it's something I've talked about a lot, is learning. Learn Spanish, learn about US interventions in Mexico, learn the metric system. When you're out walking and you see a street named after some guy, find out who that guy is. You got a phone in your pocket, you can type in his name. Learn about the pre-Hispanic traditions in Mexico too and the different pre-Hispanic peoples. It's gonna be really embarrassing if you go all the way to Chichen Itza just to call it Aztec. It's not. The next step is humility, and this really comes down to financial things. Your dollars do not make you better than anyone here. You do not get to pretend that you are on spring break forever because you have more money. The other thing about this is that back in the US, we have that weird toxic culture of the customer is always right. That doesn't exist here. You can't abuse service workers. I see Americans do it all the time, and it's embarrassing. Learn to treat people like people. More on that note, it is a bad look to complain loudly about the things you don't like in Mexico. If you really hate the spicy food or the hot weather or the loud music so much, then why are you here? Nobody's forcing you to be here. You really can't expect Mexico to change just because you're here. You're not the main character. The final step, and this might be a hard one for some of you, is to leave the bubble. Any of these expat bubbles, in Roma Norte, Sayulita, wherever you want, why do you think they exist? Why is there this community of all foreigners in the most expensive part of town? Well, it's because Mexican capitalists saw the trend of Americans moving here, so they kicked the Mexican working class people out of those places so they could sell them at prices that only an American earning dollars could afford. Well, that's good business for them, but it really destroys this whole, we're helping the economy by bringing dollars down here. What that money's actually doing is making everything harder for Mexican working class people, and it all winds up in the pockets of just a few property owners. My advice, don't participate in it. There's no rule that says because you're from the US, you must live in one of these bubbles surrounded exclusively by other foreigners and paying 3 to 4 times more what you would pay anywhere else. I think a lot of people do this because they show up and they're not comfortable speaking Spanish, so they go with what's easiest. But if you learn just enough Spanish to get out of the bubble, you're gonna actually get to experience Mexico, and not just a gringo-themed Disneyland with gluten-free muffins. One final thought to close out the video. Our home country, the United States of America, it's not a normal country. One of the last surviving settler colonialist projects in the world. Especially since the end of the Cold War and what they called the end of history in 1991, the US has had a free hand to dominate absolutely everywhere on the globe that it wants. And people have been watching that internationally. They haven't been getting the propaganda that we got in schools about American exceptionalism and how everyone in the world wants to come to America, and even inside a Mexican or an Iraqi or whoever else we're invading that week, there's an American dying to be born, dying to forget his language and learn English. None of that is true. You have to stop thinking that you come from a special place and realize that the place you come from is unpopular in most of the world, and it's for a pretty good reason. When we talk about decolonization of things like the curriculum at school, it really has to start with us as individuals. You need to decolonize your thinking, your actions, and your existence, or you're just gonna wind up repeating all of these same patterns of subjugation and degradation. You might think, oh, well, I'm not a soldier coming down here with a gun. Yeah, but you don't need to be. You can still wind up perpetuating all of these same problems just by refusing to learn. And with that, we've officially ended the English portion of this video. Entonces, a todos mis seguidores que vieron todo esto leyendo los subtítulos, muchas gracias por ver. Y un gracias especial a estas personas bonitas que me siguen apoyando en Patreon. A pesar de que estoy tardando bastante con el video sobre la CIA y cocaína. Pero ya vienen. Nomás quería hacer esto primero porque es más fácil. Son básicamente opiniones y aparte lo pude grabar en inglés. Bueno, muchas gracias y espero un video bastante pronto, pero ya no les quiero decir exactamente cuándo porque luego les quedo mal. ¡Nos vemos!